I'm in Berlin, a city which wears its heart on its sleeve. It's history too, but 80 years ago, this capital was at the heart of the so-called Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, but would ultimately collapse after 12.
Die Partei wird für alle Zukunft die politische Führungsauslese des deutschen Volkes sein.
But the impact that this short period of time had on this city was extraordinary.
This would have been built on the deaths of countless thousands of people.
Many Germans denounced people to the Gestapo.
Jews from the rest of Germany who couldn't find another country to go to, they fled from other parts of Germany to Berlin.
I've got 48 hours to explore the sites that help explain the rise and fall of the Nazis.
I'll be given exclusive access to Hitler's abandoned airport, the Nazi stadium built for the 1936 Olympics, and the very room where the Third Reich officially came to an end. There'll be ruins, models, and megastructures, all telling the story of this city's dark past. To help me understand the rise and fall of the Nazis, I'm meeting up with Berlin expert Jonny Whitlam.
Jonny, here we are under arguably the most iconic monument, not just in Berlin, but throughout Germany.
Absolutely, yes, the Brandenburg Gate. So it was originally built 1791, and the idea is that the statue on top was supposed to symbolize victory, which didn't come for a while. In fact, the opposite came when Napoleon arrived and came right through. That was back, oh gosh, all the way in 1806. And since then, really, since the defeat of Napoleon, it really became the symbol of Berlin and then later a unified Germany.
And I've been reading some of Christopher Isherwood's work. How much of what he describes about 1920s Berlin was actually how it was?
Oh, probably all of it and more. Berlin in particular, rather than the rest of Germany, was famous at this time for being kind of like an adult hedonistic playground. It was a place where you would, you know, the Ibiza of its day. You would come here to go see a wild cabaret show. Not far from here, there were 250 bars, restaurants, theaters, clubs, you name it. Maybe take some illicit substances, pay for some very grown-up services. This is also something that scared people. Right? This is new. Anything that's new is, I think, inherently scary to a lot of people. And you can imagine conservatives at the time, let alone the far right, okay? Conservatives at the time would have looked upon Berlin and thought, what are we doing? What is society descending into?
And someone who might have looked at Berlin with quite a bit of disdain is someone who we're probably going to mention quite a lot throughout our time here in Berlin, and that's, of course, Adolf Hitler.
Certainly. I can't imagine him looking at many things and liking them, particularly in Berlin at this time, but he wasn't much of a cheery fellow. I think it's very important when we talk about the history of the Nazis to see that they are complete hypocrites as well. One of Hitler's closest and most important men during the 1920s era was Ernst Röhm. Ernst Röhm was openly gay. He organized orgies in hotels. This was the absolute opposite of a secret. Josef Goebbels was physically disabled. By the Nazis' own laws, he should have been killed. Adolf Hitler was a man that would do absolutely anything and say absolutely anything to get all of the attention, all of the focus, all of the power for himself.
Adolf Hitler, he's already made a ploy for power, hasn't he?
Yeah, so Hitler actually joined the party before it was called the National Socialist Party, when it was just the German Workers' Party. And people really started to join it because of him. He was the star of the show. He was this excellent public speaker in terms of just how many people he could convert to his way of thinking, his ideology. And so he kind of elbows his way to becoming the leader of the party. And this, in a way, should have culminated in 1923 at the peak of really one of the worst moments in the history of this Weimar era, when hyperinflation had gripped the country, when everyone was a millionaire, but this wasn't really a good thing, you know? And the Nazis launched really what they thought would be a coup that would start in Munich and would start a domino effect that would see them take over Berlin, which is, you know, rather far away. It's very pie-in-the-sky thinking. A lot of the party were arrested, and then this is how Hitler becomes a star that's really known outside of Munich. But he went before 5 judges. He was given 3 hours to speak, and he impressed them. Because, well, judges judges are by their nature establishment figures. And Hitler and his like were talking about returning Germany to some kind of imagined greatness, that the revolution of November 1918 was led by criminals, and that really Germany should throw off the kind of oppression of the Treaty of Versailles that they'd signed with Britain and France, other nations, and yeah, as I mentioned, return to this kind of greatness. So instead of facing the death penalty, he was given a prison sentence. He was put in prison. He ended up staying there for about 11 months. And really, the trial made him a star, and he became a star because of his book that he wrote while he was in prison, which was Mein Kampf. He came out of prison and said he wouldn't return to politics, and he returned to politics. What can I say?
Yeah. So the violent methods haven't worked for Hitler. He comes out of prison. What next?
Well, he starts to have a little think. What could we do instead of trying to take power? We can earn power democratically. And so he turns his attention to the German parliament, the Reichstag, and it's just around the corner. Should we go and see?
Let's go. Let's have a look.
Die Partei wird für alle Zukunft die politische Führungsauslese des deutschen Volkes sein. Sie wird in ihrer Lehre unveränderlich, in ihrer Organisation stahlhart, in ihrer Taktik schmiegsam und anpassungsfähig, in ihrem Gesamtbild aber wie ein Ort sein.
Only a stone's throw away is the home of German democracy, the Reichstag Building.
Well, I think a lot of people will know what this building is today, obviously the home of the German parliament. They might not know its significance within the context of the rise of the Nazi Party. Before the 1930s, this really is the symbol of democracy, isn't it?
Yes, it was built really as the first purpose-built parliament in the Empire of Germany. It opens in the 1890s. Germany's not quite a democracy at that point, but it becomes a fully fledged democracy immediately after the First World War. And we go into this period really of idealism, let's say, but also quite a lot of chaos. 20 governments over 14 years. A new government on average every 8 months. It's quite something.
I think it would be fair to say that by the turn of the decade, that people have experienced quite a lot of economic turmoil, the Wall Street crash, and now they're ready for change, but they're not quite sure what kind of change they want.
Yeah, absolutely. Parliament is split between 14 different parties in 1930. The Nazi Party are not yet quite on 20%, but they've actually had a significant increase. They got about 2% of the vote in 1928. So they really are a party that's on the rise, as are the communists. And it's at this point that the Nazis really get better at winning votes. What they start to do is they realize that the cities where you've got either educated people or workers who are going to vote for the communists, that's not really where their support lies. So they start to venture into the places where other politicians don't go. In fact, they get Adolf Hitler a plane so he can fly to those far-flung places and make promises to people directly to them. They feel like they've been spoken to, even though he's not really one for keeping promises.
You mentioned Adolf Hitler. He's come out of prison. He's changed his tactic. His focus now is gaining as many seats as possible in that building behind us.
Yeah, and they do become the largest party in the Reichstag by 1932, which is a year of absolute chaos. There's a hung parliament in the summer, in the first election of that year. A government is kind of formed, it collapses very quickly, and there's another election already in November. And the Nazis, they actually lose a bit of the vote, from about 37% down to around 33%. People turn away from them because they're violent. But over the next couple of months, leading up to the 30th of January 33, they're able to make deals with other right-wing parties and form a coalition government and come to power legally and democratically. Hitler's a tough negotiator.
Yeah.
He says he's only going to do a deal if he becomes chancellor. So on the 30th of January 1933, after a couple of months of kind of backroom dealings, Hitler is appointed chancellor by the president in the president's palace, which is just down the road. And this gives him the keys to power here at the center of German political power at the Reichstag.
And then something absolutely monumental to the story of the rise of the Nazi Party happens right here to this building.
Yes, 27th of February 1933. Look at this. This is the Reichstag on fire. So the building set fire to in the middle of the night, and to this day, nobody is 100% sure who did it. There were 5 suspects at the time. One was a communist politician who was the last person to leave the building, a member of parliament. 3 of them were just some Bulgarian communists who happened to be in the bushes. One of those weird facts. So these 4, they actually are put, they're not even put on trial, they are cleared of any involvement. But the person who the Nazis actually pinned the fire on is a a young Dutch communist, a man named Marinus van der Lubbe. He'd had a tough life. His parents had died when he was about 12. He'd kind of brought himself up. He'd convinced himself he was a communist. He went on a pilgrimage to Moscow, and he ended up stopping here in Berlin. And whether or not he was a particularly active or vehement communist is certainly up for debate. Whether or not he liked setting fire to buildings is not. Yeah. He tried to set fire to 2 buildings already, 2 government buildings, in February of '33. Now, many people do believe that he did start the fire, and he does seem to be the most likely person. Some people take this a bit further and say that the Nazis actually made him do it, drove him here, opened the door.
Orchestrated it.
Yeah, this is where we get into rather more conspiracy territory. There's no evidence supporting the Nazis starting the fire, and they weren't modest people. It's my opinion that within the next 12 years of being in power, somebody would have let it slip. But in end effect, this building is set on fire, and there's a very clear narrative where the Nazis can blame the communists. Whether or not they believe it, they can certainly make other people believe it. And it creates a sense of fear in this country. The revolution is coming. Look at what happened to Russia and then the Soviet Union. Do you want that to happen to you? It's worth saying that the communists were popular in Germany, but they only had about 15% of the vote. Yeah. They weren't overwhelmingly popular. And so the Nazis, they built on this fear, and they used this as a platform, really, to arrest Communist Party members. The police already didn't like them. And so they take them to their own impromptu prisons. And this is key here. This is where we start to see the merge of both state and party. The police can't do the job by themselves, so the stormtroopers jump in and they help them.
And it's so visceral seeing that picture here and standing right outside. And this really does help to entrench the Nazi Party as the ruling power.
Yes, absolutely. They're able to use this as a platform really to really cement power for themselves. Through both the Reichstag Fire Decree and the Enabling Act, they essentially are given carte blanche to arrest anybody who's even tangentially involved in their thinking. And so they start to send people really to impromptu prisons that even at this point they do refer to as concentration camps, although at this point we're talking, abandoned buildings, basements. In one case in Berlin, actually, a water tower is used as one of these so-called wild camps. But really the way I look at it is that this is the first of the political opposition dominoes to fall, and over the next year to year and a half, every single political party in this country, other than the Nazis, of course, will be outlawed.
And it's really symbolic, isn't it? Seeing the home of democracy in the country on fire.
As a metaphor, it's incredibly blunt. In the entire 12 years that they're in power, this building, the symbol of democracy, stands as a burned-out wreck. They never fix it up.
Unser Führer, der Reichskanzler Adolf Hitler, hat das Wort.
Through the Enabling Act of 1933, Hitler gained wide-reaching power, allowing him to freely dismantle the democratic Weimar state and target his enemies with impunity. Hitler was determined to shape the state and society to his vision. Just over a mile from the Reichstag was the site where this vision would begin to be put into practice.
Oh, Johnny, some lovely architecture around us. Where are we now?
So we've left the Brandenburg Gate and the Reichstag down at the other end of the Royal Boulevard, the Unter den Linden, and we've entered really one of Berlin's most beautiful squares, a place named Bebelplatz, and a place that would have looked very similar in 1933 to how it does today. It's on this square where one of the very first book burnings is held.
In Berlin, wie in anderen Universitätsstädten Deutschlands, wurden undeutsche und unsittliche Bücher von den Studenten eingesammelt und öffentlich verbrannt.
Now, the book burning was originally organized by students of the then University of Berlin, now the Humboldt University. And so at the beginning of May '33, Hitler's only been in power a couple of months. It's stormtroopers who start to raid libraries across the city, including the Institute for Sexual Research, headed by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a very important person, very much lived at the wrong time, I guess you could say. He was gay, communist, and Jewish. The 1930s in Germany were very cruel to him. And 20,000 books were eventually brought inside of a university building on the side of this square. And on the 10th of May 1933, they were piled up, and these 20,000 books were burned and destroyed.
And Johnny, 20,000, that's must have been quite a spectacle. What sort of books were they burning?
All sorts of books. The idea is, who are those books by? So they are books written by Jews, communists, homosexuals, pacifists, and they are both works of fact and fiction. To illustrate the point, some of the works that were burned here were written by Albert Einstein, who was actually a professor of the university, who very fortunately was outside of the country at the end of 1932 in the elections that would sweep the Nazis into power. He decided to stay put, but many others were, of course, not so fortunate.
Yeah, and you mentioned it was fact and fiction. You have some really famous titles. All Quiet on the Western Front, a very sort of anti-war, but you can understand why that was targeted. But Time Machine, H.G. Wells, a lot of Hemingway's works were all put to the flame.
Yeah, anything that doesn't fit into the Nazis' very narrow worldview isn't fit for society. The idea, the thinking behind it is, these works are poisonous. We must remove them from society as we must remove these people and these ways of thinking from society.
Meine Kommilitonen, deutsche Männer und Frauen, das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende.
What I try to do as we enter near the centre of the Bebelplatz is I'm trying to get myself into the mind frame of those who were chucking really well-renowned and respected works of literature into the fire. What did they think they were doing? Were they so brainwashed by that point that they didn't realise that this was a hugely catastrophic but also very symbolic event?
I don't think that they were brainwashed, because I think that removes them of a certain amount of responsibility. I think they were swept up in the idea of the revolution, the idea of returning Germany to this mystical greatness that actually, when we think of students, they'd probably never really experienced. It's just a kind of, a story that's often told. Everything was better in the past, right? Doesn't matter what age you live in, people are always willing to say that. It wasn't only students that were throwing the books on the fire. There were people here decked out in their Nazi stormtrooper uniforms. Some of the people in the crowd would likely have been stormtroopers dressed as students as well to make it look bigger. And then picture yourself as a student. I think there are kind of three things that you can do. You can just walk away and pretend it's not happening. You can speak up against it and potentially make yourself a target. Or you can join in, which is perhaps the safest option, at least when you're thinking on an individual level. And I think that's what would have convinced people to join in.
Und der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein.
I'm interested also in the people who weren't involved in the book burnings. Were there people at the time who were already really starting to get concerned? When you see the images of the books alight, I mean, they must have been really frightened.
Absolutely. So there were book burnings all across the country that took part on the 10th of May 33, and then a few more that followed in the months afterwards. So it's something that would have felt close to a lot of people across the country, not just here in Berlin. I think some people would have been excited by it. I think some people would have thought, finally we're putting these awful ideas of communism and socialism and pacifism to bed, and that we need to invade other countries of Europe to complete what the Nazis called the Germanification of Europe. But certainly, if you were a Jew or a communist or a homosexual, you certainly would have been terrified at this moment.
Wir sind die geistige Grundlage der Novemberrepublik zu Boden. Aber aus diesen Trümmern wird sich siegreich erheben der Phönix eines neuen Geistes.
On the 2nd of August 1934, President Paul von Hindenburg died of lung cancer. The last obstacle standing in between Hitler and absolute power was now gone. The position of Reichskanzler was combined with the presidency, declaring Hitler as the Führer. As a result, allegiance was no longer sworn to the Republic or its constitution, but to Hitler himself.
Ich schwöre bei Gott diesen heiligen Eid, dass ich dem Führer des Deutschen Reiches und Volkes, Adolf Hitler, dem obersten Befehlshaber der Wehrmacht, unbedingten Gehorsam leisten und als tapferer Soldat bereit sein will, jederzeit für diesen Eid mein Leben einzusetzen.
But that wasn't the only change. In 1933, Hermann Göring created one of the most infamous organisations out of the Prussian secret police, the Geheime Staatspolizei, also known as the Gestapo. They became crucial in securing the new regime. This is the site of their former headquarters. Destroyed during the war, it is now the location of the Topography of Terror, a museum dedicated to the crimes committed by the SS and Nazi police forces. I'm talking to Andreas Mix to learn more about this brutal organisation.
Here was maybe the most powerful institution in the Nazi state, the secret state police called Gestapo, and it's regarded as a symbol of Nazi power and persecution. The Gestapo was founded in 1933 after Hitler came to power, more or less immediately. It emerged from the political police of the Weimar Republic. That means it was the branch responsible for persecution of political motivated crimes.
Originally tasked with rooting out political opposition, the main target of the Gestapo were communists and social democrats. Their mission was greatly expanded for the appointment of Heinrich Himmler as head of the German police forces in 1936. The Gestapo was now able to target anyone who was perceived as an enemy of the people. This included homosexuals, various religious groups, and the Jews.
Many Germans denounced people to the Gestapo. For example, neighbors or people at work. Yeah, that was a fact. For example, during the war, my neighbor listened to BBC London, and he told me that Hitler will not win the war. And if somebody told this to the Gestapo, that's a problem for this. Definitely a problem for this man or woman.
During the Nazi period, thousands of people passed through the prison, located in the basement of the building.
Usually the Gestapo arrested people, arrested by protective custody order. That means the Gestapo, they can decide on their own. They decided on their own to arrest people, imprison people. There was no chance to go to court, or there was no chance for a judge to get into this process. The Gestapo acted on their own.
They had printed a confession already for me. I didn't want to sign it. So after a while, they put me into a cell. It was, like you call it, a solitary confinement. I was so miserable, I was beaten up, I was swollen. I didn't feel my arms, I didn't feel my legs. I couldn't open up my mouth. And I said to myself, what am I going to do? Really, it was a torture like medieval times. Probably, maybe worse.
One of the core tenets of Nazi ideology was anti-Semitism. In 1933, the party began restricting access to German schools and universities. 1935 saw the implementation of the infamous Nuremberg laws, stripping Jews from their Reich citizenship and prohibiting them from having sexual or marital relations with persons of German or German-related blood. They couldn't vote or stand for public office. They were effectively pushed out of society. This was all accompanied by an avalanche of anti-Semitic propaganda aimed at the German people, convincing them to subscribe to the Nazi way of thinking. The pre-war culmination of the increased targeting of Jews was Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. Synagogues across Germany were destroyed by violent mobs, but miraculously, the largest one in Berlin, the new synagogue, survived the violence.
Jess, by 1938, the Jews have been persecuted for almost half a decade already. Why is the Night of the Broken Glass such an important, significant moment within the history of the Holocaust?
Well, you could say because by this point in 1938 is when you have the first major outbreak of violence against the Jews all over the country. By that point, there had been smaller, sporadic outbreaks, riots that took place usually by members of the brown shirts throughout the 1930s or even before. Three things happen in rapid succession. In July of 1938, you have the Evian Conference, where basically the rest of the world is watching what is happening to the Jewish population, and 32 countries meet in Evian to discuss whether or not they're going to take in Jewish refugees that are now threatened by the Nazis in Germany and Austria. They basically decide it's unfortunate what's happening, but nobody is going to increase their migration quotas. So the Nazis view this almost as being a sort of confirmation of what's happening. Nobody's going to actually really stop them from doing anything. So they begin ramping things up. In October, they start by targeting the Jews in Germany that they designate as Polish. So they deport about 17,000 Polish Jews from all over the country into Poland. They take away their passports if they had German passports beforehand and basically tell them it's Poland's problem now. The Polish government doesn't want to accept most of them, so a lot of these people end up basically in limbo, stuck on the border between Germany and Poland in the middle of fall. And the son of one of these people, one of these families that ended up getting deported to Poland, his name is Herschel Greenspan, and he was living in Paris at the time, and he decided he was going to do something about it, so he purchased a gun on the black market, and he goes to the German embassy in Paris and ends up assassinating a worker at the embassy named Ernst von Rath. So Ernst von Rath dies from his injuries a couple days later, and Josef Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, who has already been pushing for something like Kristallnacht for weeks ahead of time, he says, essentially, this is now the moment. Now we have the perfect excuse. The propaganda ministry, Josef Goebbels especially, was very interested in presenting this, of saying, look, this is normal. This is like normal rage that is popping up inside of the German population. It's not only the Nazi Party. Everybody is on the same page with this. That was really important to the way that this was going to be presented. Also internally, but also to the international public.
Forgive me, but some people who aren't perhaps aware of what the actual situation was like for the Jewish population, they might say, well, why didn't more people escape at the time? But their hands were tied.
It was very difficult for them to leave, even if they had the means to do so. I mean, it's estimated between 1933 and 1938, around, let's say, half of Germany's Jewish population did leave the country.
Yeah.
And those are the ones who had the means to do so. They had an ability to leave the country. Usually it wasn't the problem of being able to leave Germany, it was a problem of finding a country that was willing to let you in.
What exactly happens on the 9th of November?
So basically all over the country, you have also members of the German population joining in, but you have groups that are, in all likelihood, probably members of the SS, members of the brown shirt in plain clothes, basically orchestrating attacks on Jews in neighborhoods that have a high Jewish population out in the middle of the street. You also have them breaking into people's apartments, destroying their businesses, but also especially setting synagogues on fire.
As we reached the synagogue and halted, silent and angry, on the fringe of the mob, flames began to rise from one end of the building. It was the signal for a wild cheer. The crowd surged forward, and greedy hands tore seats and woodwork from the building to feed the flames. Behind us, we heard more shouts. Turning, we saw a section of the mob start off along the road towards Israel's store. Piles of granite cubes, ostensibly for repairing the roads, had been heaped. Youths, men, and women, howling deliriously, hurled the blocks through the windows and out the closed doors. In a few minutes, the doors gave way, and the mob, shouting and fighting, surged inside to pillage and loot.
Not all of them were completely destroyed, but many of them were damaged. This one was also damaged. It couldn't be completely destroyed because a group of police officers essentially intervened. Nobody knows exactly why they did so, but it is a very interesting story.
Well, Jess, here's the evidence that the rest of the building unfortunately didn't survive the war. Where are we standing at the moment?
We're standing at the former location of the main prayer hall of this building. It had seats for about 3,200 people.
Right, so this was pretty badly damaged.
Yes.
By Allied bombers or by the Nazis?
So during Kristallnacht, it was damaged somewhat, but it wasn't structurally damaged to the extent that they couldn't keep using it. They actually did continue using it up until 1940. Then it was confiscated by the Nazis for the most part and used as a storage area.
Right.
Also for documents that they were basically abusing from the archives of the Jewish community. In order to hunt people, essentially, look up people's Jewish heritage, find them, locate them, etc. And it was badly damaged by aerial bombardment in November of 1943, which is after the point where you have real serious area bombardment of Berlin in general after that point. So this was badly damaged during the war, and the main prayer hall was then torn down after the war was over. So there was still a structure here standing, but it was torn down in 1956.
So in no way was this allowed to be used by any of the Jewish population from 1939, 1940 onwards?
1940 is when it was confiscated, so it was no longer being used for religious ceremonies, not openly anyways. So there were still members of the Jewish community who were working inside of this building. It was an association which was called the Reichsassociation of Jews in Germany. So these were administrators of the Jewish community who were also forced by the Nazis to work with them.
Right.
Essentially to catalog Jewish-owned property, to create deportation lists for them. They continued to work in part of the building.
So I do find it absolutely fascinating, the fact that even by 1940s, that there are still Jewish ceremonies allowed to happen within this building.
Yeah, well, I mean, by that point, most of the original Jewish population of Berlin has tried to flee the country. About half of them have fled. But people often forget that Jews from the rest of Germany who couldn't find another country to go to, they fled from other parts of Germany to Berlin.
Right, okay.
Right? So because it was easier to blend in here up to a certain point. If you were a Jewish person living in a rural community, you
stuck out like a sore thumb.
You stuck out on like a sore thumb. So if you moved to Berlin, your chances were maybe better. That's what a lot of people thought. So even though many Berlin Jews had fled by that point, there was also people coming from other parts of Germany into Berlin. And the Nazis didn't outright forbid Jewish religious ceremonies. What their point was at the beginning was to basically shut Jews out of German public life, to create a separation between what is Jewish and what is German, and what is Jewish cannot be German.
Right.
So if you were a Jewish artist or a Jewish musician, you were no longer allowed to perform in German venues. You could perform in Jewish venues.
Understood, okay. So as long as it's sort of behind closed doors in hidden areas,
yes,
then that was considered just about acceptable, but only until 1940. I'm assuming it stops after that point.
Until the war starts. I mean, basically, the escalation of violence against Jews escalates dramatically after World War II begins, with the invasion of Poland and then with the invasion of the Soviet Union. And once they're in the middle of this situation of all-out war, they then start really declaring war on the Jewish population, where they're not just trying to separate them from the rest of the population of Germany, they're now trying to murder them. It's after the war starts that you have the laws in place saying that people now have to wear the yellow star openly. You're literally not allowed to blend in. And if you were caught not wearing the star and you're supposed to, then that's reason to send you to a concentration camp.
Why didn't the Nazis just flatten the whole thing?
Well, the Nazis might have over time done such a thing, but at this point it wasn't necessarily on their radar to be just after Kristallnacht going back and destroying buildings that were left over, right? They were much more in the business of repurposing them and using them for other things, which is in some way what happened here.
And just give me a breakdown and an understanding of exactly how many Jews lived within Berlin at the time.
So right before the Nazis come to power, we could say that there was about 170,000 Jews living in Berlin. They made up only 4% of the city's whole population. So 170,000 before the Nazis come to power. By 1938, there's about 80,000. So it has been halved, just give or take. By the end of the war, estimates tend between 7,000 to 8,000, and most of them don't stick around very long. They leave in the next couple of years after the wars end.
Evidence of the horrific destruction of the Jewish community in Berlin has been preserved inside the new synagogue.
So if you see here, you have a list of around 50,000 names. So these are the 50,000 Jews living in Berlin who were deported. The names that are in white, so the lighter ones, those are those who actually survived.
Oh, it's so powerful, that.
Every year on specific days, they actually go through and invite people to read out from a list of every single one of these names, essentially.
Wow.
Usually on the Holocaust Memorial Day.
Jeez. And the decision to put those in bold that survive, I think that's really powerful as well.
Yeah.
Not only were the Nazis focused on who could live in the city, but also what the city looked like itself. They wanted to transform Berlin into a worthy capital of the 1,000-year Reich.
Wow. So this is my first time seeing proper Nazi architecture.
Yes, and it would have been the first time that many Berliners had seen this kind of architecture too. This was the first big project that the Nazis built here in Berlin, designed by Ernst Zagerbiel and built in only 1.5 years.
Yeah, the first thing that strikes me is just how big it is.
Yeah, it's kind of like a skyscraper on its side. In fact, if you stand on this corner, you might think it's just this first little bit, but the further down you look, you can see it takes up really an entire block of the city.
Yes, and what was the purpose of this building?
So what the Nazis told people it was in 1936 was it was Germany's brand new civil aviation ministry. In reality, it never served that purpose. It was instead the headquarters of the newly formed Luftwaffe.
So Hermann Goering would have been working in this building behind us.
That's what he would have told people. He didn't even have an office inside of it. It was all for, it was just kind of for show. He lived around the corner though.
And when exactly was this constructed?
Construction began February 1935 and it was completed on the 1st of August 1936.
Right, so right about the time when a whole lot of people are going to be coming to the city for the Olympics.
Exactly at that time. That's why they rushed to get it finished in time, because this building had its grand opening on the same day that the Olympic opening ceremony took place. Anyone who was anyone in Nazi Germany that had been invited here for the Olympics was invited to a party here with Hermann Goering to show off, really, to flex the Nazi muscles, I suppose.
And I'm interested actually about the architectural style of Nazi buildings. It's got that sort of neoclassical element with the pillars, but it's still quite a plain looking building. Absolutely, we've got lots of columns, repetition, symmetry. They've looked at Roman architecture, Greek architecture, they've taken that, made it bigger, and simplified it. We've got these straight, harsh, and actually for the time, rather modern lines. And the building looks pristine, considering what happened to Berlin. It's quite striking that this still stands today. How original is it? For the most part, this building is still the original. It took very little damage from aerial bombardment and during the Battle of Berlin. In fact, Soviet soldiers made this a makeshift base for one night right at the end of the Second World War. And then following that, this building became the Ministry of Ministries in communist East Germany. Essentially their most important government ministry. And so certainly the East Germans would have held onto it and looked after it for a good 40 years. And even today, it is still a government ministry. It is the Federal Ministry of Finance. But this is far from the only surviving example of Nazi architecture in Berlin. In fact, I've got something a lot more impressive to show you, the Tempelhof Airport.
After a quick drive, we arrived at one of the largest buildings the Nazis left in Berlin.
Johnny, I thought the Luftwaffe headquarters was big, but this is even bigger.
Absolutely, yes. This is the Tempelhof Airport, and It's one of the, I guess, best surviving examples of Nazi architecture in the center of Berlin, and actually a place that was in full use as an airport right the way until very recently, until 2008. When the Luftwaffe headquarters was opened in 1936, it's the largest office building in Europe. Well, when this opens, it's certainly among the very largest buildings really in the world. It's 1.2 kilometers long. You know, it takes a decent amount of time to walk from end to end. You know? For the Berliners, this would have been seen as a real expression of Nazi power.
Yes, yeah, it kind of gives me that sort of, I feel in a way a little bit intimidated by it. I don't know why, but it just gives me that sort of feeling.
Yeah, that's really the plan. And actually you would feel more intimidated, at least up till the 1960s even, quite a bit after World War II was finished, when on the roof of this building, above the main entrance, there was still a great big eagle there.
Right, yes, and we've seen there is actually some of the remnants of that eagle all around the entrance of this building.
Yeah, there's eagles that adorn the building, and then the big eagle at the center was decapitated, let's say. It was dismantled in the 1960s, and the head was then placed over here so that we can still see it today.
This is a great example of the enormous buildings that he wanted all over Berlin.
They actually would never build most of what they had planned, but when you come and see things like the former Luftwaffe headquarters, like this, you certainly get an idea for just how fragile their egos were, that they needed to say, we are so big and strong, right? Look at us.
For me, it would be more of a dystopia. If every building looked similar to this, I can't imagine what that kind of world would have looked like for the people of Berlin.
Well, absolutely, but it shows you, from the very beginning in the 1920s, diversity is not exactly what the Nazis are into, right? They'd say, this is what is German, this is what we like, and you can see that in terms of architecture. When you think of 1920s architecture, when you think of the Bauhaus movement, the Nazis declared that Bauhaus was un-German. Well, they're designed by Germans and made by Germans in Germany.
And was this designed by the same architect as the Luftwaffe headquarters?
Yes, Ernst Zagerbier. And usually when we look at Nazi architecture, everybody immediately thinks, oh, it must be Speer, it must be Speer. And Albert Speer was definitely the most important Nazi architect, but he wasn't there from the very beginning. He wasn't, Hitler's best pal in 1933. He actually gets the job as the general building director of Berlin at the end of 1937. So the Luftwaffe building is finished middle of 36, and then Speer kind of is put in charge of everything that would be built in Berlin. It doesn't mean that he does all of the drawings himself, but it means that when it came to this project, Ernst Zagerbier had to really refer to Speer as his boss, as his superior.
Jonny, you weren't wrong. This is, wow, it's a remarkable view, and this is where you really get a sense of the scale of this project.
Yeah, it was designed to be impressive, right? This massive long building, 1.2 kilometers long. So people from across the world were expected to land here and marvel at this kind of spectacle of really what the new Germany that the Nazis were building. Now, the idea here as well is that they're really trying to show off the modernity, the kind of ingenuity in a way. This building is designed to show off. So the entire roof here is cantilevered, meaning that the entire thing can open up and planes can taxi inside under the roof. So you can imagine if it's raining, you arrive, you're completely dry. And when you're down there, how often do you stand right next door to a plane? You more than me, I'm guessing, but you do get this sense of scale when you're in there. And with that comes a sense of power.
Our next stop lies on the outskirts of the city, the iconic Olympic Stadium.
Straight stone pillars. It's absolutely massive. It must have been designed by the Nazis.
This is the Olympiastadion. Now, this area There was already a stadium near here before. There was already a planned Olympic stadium here for the 1916 Olympic Games, which were of course cancelled due to the First World War. Berlin has quite bad luck with the Olympics. I always say it's like the Colosseum, right? They've looked at that and they said, what if that was modern? What if that was bigger? What if that was more imposing? And it's one of these things where from the outside, it's certainly big and impressive and imposing, but because it's a recess stadium, once you're on the inside, you really get this double wow effect, let's say.
And in terms of its size, what is the capacity of this thing? How many people can it hold?
100,000 originally. For modern tastes, it actually holds closer to about 77,000 because, yeah, it was updated in 2004.
Well, it's certainly an impressive structure on the outside. Let's take a look inside. Jonny, we're here pitchside, the home of Hertha Berlin. This is the track where Usain Bolt broke the world record, still stands today. But travel back to 1936 and you would have had 100,000 people in here. I think even if you weren't converted to the cause of the Nazis, it would have been tough not to be patriotic about this monumental event in history.
I mean, it is designed to impress. The Olympics were, a couple of weeks of excitement that came in the early years of the regime. Actually, quite curiously, Adolf Hitler didn't really like the sound of the idea of the Olympics when he first came to power. It was Goebbels who started to whisper in his ear, this is a great chance, not just to impress our fellow Germans, not just Europe, but really to impress the entire world.
And this also was one of the first Olympics to be televised. So you can see what the atmosphere must have been like. It just looks absolutely incredible when you see that footage.
It was indeed the first Olympics to be televised live, filmed by Leni Riefenstahl, although I must say you couldn't have picked it up over in London, for example. I think the signals only went as far as Potsdam. But still, when we think of how impressive the Nazis might have been to, let's say, the average German or somebody who wasn't political, someone who was maybe on the fence about whether these new changes over the last 3 years were good for them, I think something like, well, we're the most technologically advanced country on earth. We've got one of the largest stadiums in the world. It would have started to impress people and perhaps would have started to make them feel patriotic. That really was, I guess, the point of it from the Nazi perspective.
Hitler himself would have been standing just over there to our right,
yes,
addressing his nation and the supporters and the athletes.
Yes, Hitler surrounded by a lot of the top-ranking Nazis, actually. Yeah, you're talking Hess and Goering and Goebbels. They wouldn't have all been here all of the time for 16 days, but certainly they did try and wheel out Adolf Hitler when they thought that a German might win a gold medal, for example.
Mm-hmm. And of course, at the time, you have a lot of military mobilisation, but this event is still, it's a bit of a diplomatic mission on their part. They're welcoming all and everyone, all nations are welcome here.
Yeah, that's the message, that this is about peace. This is about coming together. This is about a kind of global event, a global celebration. And you have to remember, 1 year before this, the Luftwaffe had already been unveiled. Germany had agreed not to have an air force after World War I. And they were starting to break and bend those rules.
Underlying all of this, and when people think of the 1936 Nazi Olympics, there's this almost tacit narrative that Hitler is trying to push here, the superior race of his Aryan, Nordic, fit and strong young athletes.
Yes, definitely. And this really begins with the running of the Olympic torch. The first time this has ever been done. So it came not from where the previous Olympics had been, it came up from Greece, right? Very symbolic. Yeah. And the man that was at the front, at the end, that lit the torch at the end of this stadium.
Just over there, right?
Just over there was Fritz Schilgen, who, what can I say, he very much cut the image that the Nazis preferred, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, supposedly superior Aryan race. First, a torch was lit on the Museum Island, right at the very center, the very heart of old Berlin, really. And then it was run down the Unter den Linden, through the Tiergarten, through the newer part of Berlin, Charlottenburg, and then, as you said, into the stadium, down across the bottom here, and then up the stairs to the end.
Ich verkünde die Spiele von Berlin zur Feier der 11. Olympiade neuer Zeitrechnung als eröffnet.
And so how did Hitler and the Nazis balance diplomacy, but also the reality of what was happening at the time in Germany?
Yeah, I mean, this was an event where really they were attempting to pull the wool over the eyes of anybody and everybody that was visiting, including Germans, of course, as well. So anti-Semitic signs would have been taken down saying Jews aren't allowed in these woods, Jews aren't allowed to go swimming here. About 600 Sinti and Roma were cleared out of Berlin in the couple of weeks before the Olympic Games started. And during the 1930s, different countries were talking about whether or not they would actually boycott this Olympics. And so the Nazis actually tried to field, or they did field, one Jewish athlete, Helena Meyer, who had previously won a gold in 1928 in fencing. So they said, well, look, we're letting the Jews compete. There's no way that we're not letting Jews onto our team, when in reality, actually one of the first things the regime did when they came to power, April 33, is they start to lock Jews out of any kind of organizations, including sports.
So essentially, Johnny, this is just one gigantic propaganda event.
Yeah, absolutely. They want people from across the world, and I mean, who can afford to travel in 1936? It's wealthy and influential people, that they would come here and have a good time and essentially go home and say to anybody and everybody they've met, oh, it doesn't matter what you've read in the news, I've been there. I know what it's really like. In reality, of course, they don't.
One of the most famous events that occurs at this Olympics, Jesse Owens takes home 4 gold medals.
Yes, the most of any athlete at the 1936 Olympics. It's very important to state that Jesse Owens was a black athlete from the US, somebody that would have undergone a lot of struggles at home, let alone being talented enough to come here and then brave enough to stand in front of Adolf Hitler and win the 100 meters, 200 meters. He was on the winning team of the 4x100 relay. But the most interesting and most important story for me is how he won the gold in the long jump.
He competes directly against one of Hitler's golden boys, doesn't he?
Yes, Lutz Long, the long jumper. He cuts the Aryan figure that the Nazis would have liked. Now, in the morning, in the qualifying rounds, Owens was jumping badly. He was kind of out of sorts. There's some kind of stories that happen after the fact where apparently the two come together and Long helps him, but actually this is sadly rather made up. So when it gets to the afternoon, when it gets to the finals, each athlete has 3 jumps and they keep kind of outdoing each other like this. Actually, on Long's 3rd jump, he breaks the European record, but he only equals Jesse Owens' previous jump. So Owens has 1 more, only the final jump can make it. He jumps over 8 meters and he takes home gold. And then, amazingly, the two of them come together, crash down to the ground, and they are photographed, and it's the exact opposite symbol that the Nazis want. This so-called Aryan Superman arm in arm with his new friend, Jesse Owens, this black man from the US.
It might have not have been Hitler's ideal dream scenario, but Jesse Owens still remains written up there as one of the winners right here in the
His name still is on the walls of this stadium today, and actually there's a one of the lounges, I believe in the VIP area, is named the Jesse Owens Lounge.
The Olympic Stadium, Luftwaffe headquarters, and Tempelhof Airport are some of the only surviving examples of grand Nazi architecture in Berlin. But there was once a vision for all of Berlin to be built up with these structures, to become a worthy capital of the 1,000-year Reich, Welthauptstadt, Germania. To get a sense of what Hitler's utopia would have looked like, we were visiting the Berlin Underworld's museum.
So this is Hitler's dream Berlin?
Kind of. Actually, this model is not even totally to scale. In fact, if anything, it should be even bigger.
No.
Yeah. This is a version that's been made for various film and TV productions over the years, but it still really shows us the kind of the core of what Adolf Hitler and his best architect friend Albert Speer wanted to build. And so we start over here with just one of two giant train stations. This would be called the South
So
Station.
that right here, that's the train station.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So imagine people arrive from the south, they enter then this boulevard. You can see all these guns here.
All these artillery pieces, yeah.
Well,
I guess a bit like a parade centre, sort of?
It certainly would be used for parades, but the guns are not German. They are spoils of war. So
Right.
after they've taken over all the armies of Europe, they would display their weapons here. And then, of course, what comes after the stolen booty is the Triumphal Arch. Hitler's Brandenburg Gate, if you will. And what can I say? Nothing can be big enough. The biggest is obviously the best, and therefore we need a Triumphal Arch that's 4 times the size of the Arc de Triomphe, and so big that the Arc de Triomphe can fit just beneath the arch there. And
that is insane.
And speaking of the Brandenburg Gate, we should see just how small it would be in comparison to this if we come right the way down here.
You've got very much all the sort of neoclassical stripped-back architecture as we go along here.
Yes, not all of those are totally accurate. They kind of needed to fill some space for the film and TV, but it is faithful to the style the Nazis would have liked. Wow. And then if you look just down here,
that's what we've just been to.
I mean, the comparison of the size. And of course, this is where we met. I mean, it's... it not only shows you the madness, it gets even bigger after this. Over this way would be the Grand Hall. And very fortunately for scale here, and this part is accurate, we've got the Reichstag Building right next to it.
So this really is Hitler's pièce de résistance, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, this is the pinnacle of the vanity project, I suppose. They think that about 180,000 people could come in there just to listen to Hitler rant and rave, and
180,000 people inside just listening to Hitler go on his long tirades about
all the people he hated, I suppose. And so because it's a building designed in the 1930s, 1940s, it's not designed with modern ventilation systems. So calculations do show that the sweat from the 180,000 visitors to the building could have basically clung to the ceiling and then started to, in effect, rain down.
So they would be listening to Hitler under a sweat shower, as you will.
A rain of Nazi sweat.
That is that's quite an image.
One I didn't really want to share. It's quite something, hey?
Johnny, seeing the size comparison with the Brandenburg Gate, it's just absolutely insane. How are they going to do this? Who was going to build it?
It was going to be built using slave labor. Already in the early years of the regime, at places like Sachsenhausen, former concentration camp, there was a brick factory, there were quarries that were next to other concentration camps. This is, in effect, one of the reasons why the camp system got so big. And in effect, this would have been built on the deaths of countless thousands of people.
Well, obviously, Johnny, this gigantic dome, probably for the better, doesn't exist. Did any of this actually get built?
I guess you can say kind of. They cleared large parts of the city. They moved the victory column from the front of the Reichstag garden here, and then they made some lampposts.
Oh, okay. So some lampposts, not quite the Nazi utopia Hitler had in mind.
No, but there is one big piece of evidence that's still left.
Going back to the south of Berlin, not far from Tempelhof Airport, lies one of the most unusual historic sites of the city.
Johnny, this is really the definition of a Nazi megastructure.
This is what's called the heavy load-bearing body, although I do really like the German name. Of course, they have a word for that. The Schwerbelastungskörper. The idea is that right next to us is where Hitler's really over-the-top triumphal arch would have been built, but can the swampy ground of Berlin take such a weight? We don't know. So in 1941, using foreign forced labor, actually French laborers, the heavy load-bearing body was built. It's over 12,000 tons.
Whoa.
Yes, and this really is only the tip of the iceberg.
Oh wait, so this extends, what, below ground?
Absolutely, so we can see 14 meters of concrete above ground and there's a further 18 beneath the earth.
Speer, those kind of people, they're involved in this project?
Speer would absolutely be involved in this project. He's the guy who has to report to Adolf Hitler, and essentially this is a dictatorship where the dictator's word is law. He has to say, oh yes, everything is going to work. And so they start to do these tests, but, well, will they ever see the results?
So when did construction start on this?
So the heavy load-bearing body was built in 1941.
So that really is, that's like when the Nazis are at the zenith of their power, certainly in terms of geographical territory gained.
Yes, they've started to invade multiple countries. Things are going very well for them in terms of the war. They are going to invade the Soviet Union in the same year. And of course, according to the Nazis, it's not just if they'll win, it's when they'll win, and how glorious will our capital look at that point. So even during World War II, such is Nazi hubris that they start to build huge, heavy structures like this.
Structures like this demonstrate the wild ambition of the Nazi Empire. But it's when you look inside that cracks start to appear.
Wow, look at this. God, you almost have a bit of an uneasy sense when you come in here.
Yes, the floor is definitely not straight, which tells you a lot, right?
Yeah.
So they pile in the 12,000 tons of concrete. You can see that they set up wood first, and then they just poured the concrete in. But even more so, they dug 18 meters beneath the ground here. It's what they thought was a particularly sensitive part of Berlin's soil. There, they put pressure sensing equipment, which is really the latest and greatest technology of its time. And in a way, that same technology is still used today. And then they filled that all up with concrete. And then they sat, and as you can say, with this uneasy feeling of this floor, they sat and watched it sink. Although the tests that they did wouldn't be fully completed until after World War II.
But I think the evidence we have today is that ultimately Speer and Hitler's tests, it failed.
They would have failed. They would never have been able to build these huge monuments, just in a purely physical sense.
It's quite remarkable that we can see it today. Why does it still stand?
Simply because things like this are very hard to get rid of. 12,000 tons of concrete would take either a lot of manual labor or some very big explosives, which I don't think the neighbors would be very happy with. People live right next to this thing, and I don't think anyone wanted to see even more of Berlin blown up after World War II.
Well, it's certainly a Nazi megastructure, but in reality, it's a monument of failure.
Absolutely. This only proves that what they wanted to build wouldn't work, as I would argue how they wanted to change society wouldn't work.
On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
In contrast to 1914, there was no great public enthusiasm for a new war in Berlin, with many fearful that the hardships of the First World War would return. Life for the everyday Berliner would change considerably. The nights became darker as all light sources had to be covered after sunset to protect the city against enemy bombing raids. But it wouldn't be until 1940 when the first RAF bombs fell on Berlin. Hitler eventually ordered the construction of formidable anti-aircraft towers.
Well, they may not have been able to build Hitler's Welthauptstadt Germania. They were able to construct this structure. What a view, first of all.
Yeah, it's quite a nice place to be these days. As you can see, people come and hang out here. But yeah, it is really one of the largest structures that the Nazis built that's still left, definitely in the city. But this was designed to protect the city. This was what was called a Flak Tower.
Right, I'm assuming it's to fire into the sky.
Yes, so where we're standing, and as you can see over here, these were large gun emplacements, in fact, very large. There would have been twin 128mm cannons really on top of these.
And again, the size of this, it rises above Berlin. This must have been an absolute mammoth to build.
You're absolutely right. There were 3 of these in Berlin, and each one weighed 100,000 tons.
And when was this built exactly?
Yes, so the Nazis planned to go to war, but they didn't plan for the war to come to them. So it was only after Berlin was bombed in August of 1940 that the decision was made to build 3 of these huge battle towers in the city.
Wasn't that going to unnerve the population a little bit?
I think after the first bombing raids, this is something that would have actually bolstered the Berliners in terms of their psychology. There were 3 of these built in different parks. Each one of them rises high above the park. It also gives a bit of clear space around them, you know, for the noise and for the damage that would hit them. I think knowing that you had one of these would have made you feel good, but in reality, these were not good at shooting down planes, much better at deterring them. None of the 3 towers shot down even 40 planes each, as it were, during the war.
And it was also used as an air raid shelter, wasn't it?
Yes, they were multifunctional. Each one had its own command center, power generator, water supply, kitchens, kind of miniature hospital or infirmary as well. The Zoo Tower, rather than the Humboldt-Hain Tower where we are, was also used to store art. And then, yeah, like you said, they're bomb-proof, so to say. So 12,000 Berliners would pile into these when the air raids were coming. But they were designed for fewer people than that. Conditions inside were appalling. Cramped, damp, not knowing what's happening outside. Above all else, there were ventilation systems, but because so many people were inside of them, the ventilation systems couldn't keep up. These places would run out of oxygen.
Yeah.
And the way that they tried to measure the oxygen is using a candle, right? When it goes out, there's not enough oxygen in there. So no matter what is happening outside, you will die in here, so you have to get out there.
How are they coming to terms with the fact that although they were expanding into enemy territory, they probably would have heard a lot of propaganda about it, they still know that this city is still vulnerable, even if it is from the air?
Yeah, I think the city would have felt more and more vulnerable as the years went by. Those first air raids that came to hit Berlin, they were what were called nuisance raids. You know, a flex of the muscles, let you know that we could if we wanted to. The change is then made in the summer of 1943 to switch from targeted bombing to try and hit military targets that the RAF were absolutely hopeless at doing, and to then not waste those resources and lives of the bomber crews, and to switch instead to what was called area bombing. Essentially, if you can't hit a small target, hit a big one. And it's November of 1943 that we see the first large air raid hit Berlin. The guns that were up on the top of these battle towers here were designed not just so that they could shoot up into the air, but so that they could actually tilt down just a couple of degrees as well. And if you were a Soviet tank commander, in April of 1945, as the Red Army are enveloping the city and moving towards the center, this is what you'd be scared of.
Yeah, you've got a pretty good vantage point from up here. You can see far into the distance.
Definitely, but it's not just line of sight that matters. There were spotter teams during the Battle of Berlin that would radio in exactly where people were, and the gunners up here, they had the coordinates, they knew how to maneuver their guns to wipe these tanks off the face of the earth, essentially.
And it's almost ironic looking around today, people enjoying the view, enjoying a drink, and to think how important places like this and how symbolic they were during some of the most devastating and crippling battles of the Second World War.
Yeah, I have to say, I think it's a great symbol that, a place of fear and terror and death and murder has been turned into a place where, frankly, locals like to spend their free time, like to enjoy the views, like to relax, listen to music. Have a good time.
At the start of the Second World War, there were still 80,000 Jews living in Berlin. Between 1941 and 1943, 60,000 of them were deported to ghettos and extermination camps across the newly occupied Eastern territories. The conditions were brutal. Only a few survived. But there were Germans who risked their lives to protect Jews from the Nazi state. One of these remarkable people was Otto Weidt.
So Johnny, we've taken a turn off the busy high street onto this lovely looking alleyway here. We're in the old historic Jewish quarter, and there are so many stories within the Second World War of brave women and men who really risked their lives trying to protect members of the Jewish population. And one remarkable story happens right here.
Yeah, it's a truly fantastic story, and the star of this story, as it were, is a wonderful man named Otto Weidt, a non-Jewish, legally blind man who had a workshop in this courtyard upstairs here where workers were working on brooms and brushes, and, well, many of them were either Jewish or blind or both. And through this workshop and through forging documents and organizing hiding spaces, Otto Weidt was able to either save or at the very least extend the lives of many of Berlin's Jews.
And how was he able to actually hire them in the first place?
Well, he had a contract with the government, with the Nazi government. The brooms and brushes were deemed necessary for the war effort, so a special exception was made such that Jews were still allowed to work here, really when we're getting into the most dangerous time.
Wow. Well, we're right here at the doorsteps. Let's have a look inside.
Let's head in.
Here we are, Johnny, right in Otto Weidt's workshop. You can see some of the workspaces here, the machinery that his workers would have been using, but clearly at some point the police were going to start asking more and more questions, and he had to protect them. How did he do it?
Yeah, well, one thing he did was to really play the part. When the Gestapo came and made surprise visits, he would turn into the kind of authority figure that the Nazis liked. He would bark orders and shout anti-Semitic insults as well. But he would go much further than that. There was one point when a woman who worked for him named Inga Deutschkorn she was in hiding at the time. She wasn't officially working here. And a woman came, her former landlord, to ask for her rent. Of course, she hasn't paid her rent. She's officially not here anymore. And she was hiding in the room while this woman was saying, "Where's the money?" He said, "Well, I don't know. I haven't seen her. But because I haven't seen her, I haven't paid her." And so he just pulls out a bunch of money and says, "Here's her last 2 months' wages. You can have that."
So he is having to be quite creative.
Yeah, absolutely. He would help to falsify papers. He helped to organize hiding spaces across Berlin, but also he had a hiding space in here in the workshop as well. It was right at the end over this way. Yeah, let's go and see.
Yes. And so, Johnny, all of these are original walls as well?
It appears so. I really do have a feeling of the past in here, I think you could say.
And they would have been working. Everything seemed normal here.
Yes, until you get to the end. And this was a wardrobe placed in front of a doorway, and behind it is a windowless room that was used to hide the Horn family, 4-person family. And actually, if you were to say, open these doors, you could have a look inside.
Oh my goodness me. Wow. Oh, we have to use the lights for this.
So crucially, a completely windowless room. But sadly, the family were eventually betrayed. And in October of 1943, they were taken away to Auschwitz and they were murdered.
I mean, it's just something about this so harrowing. It's because of its simplicity. It's just a dark and dingy room that is hiding a family.
At a certain point, this place would have become their entire lives.
I mean, that's just extraordinary. And so obviously they're coming after a lot of his workforce. And there is that day, isn't there, where it's almost like the last roundup in Berlin. And,
yes.
And Weidt's not able to save everyone.
No, so that kind of last day, the idea behind this last roundup was the so-called Fabrikaktion, so the factory operation, 27th of February 43. And the idea is that the last Jews, the last Jewish workers in Berlin, most of whom have only been allowed to stay here because they are married to non-Jews or they have other kind of connections like this. But the Nazis come to several places of essentially forced labor, not that that's what this was, and they start to round people up. And Otto Weidt keeps the workshop closed on that day. He's tipped off about it.
Oh, that's extraordinary. And whilst the Horn family unfortunately weren't able to survive the conflict, there is someone that Otto Weidt went to a whole length of trouble to save.
Yes, it's a fantastic story. Her name is Alice Liszt, and I can actually better tell you about it just through here. So Alice Licht has this absolutely amazing story that's told in the museum right over here. And so growing up, she'd wanted to be a doctor, but she was a 17-year-old Jewish girl in Berlin when the Nazis came to power. This wasn't going to be possible.
And that's her there?
This is her right here, yeah. And eventually she was able to come to work for Otto Weidt because she'd faked the symptoms of stomach ulcers at her job working in a kind of a parachute factory as a form of forced labor. So a doctor said, she can't do this anymore, it's too strenuous. Otto Weidt steps in, oh, well, she can work for me. So she comes to work here, and her parents end up being very close to Otto Weidt. Her parents will, after the Fabrikaktion, go into hiding, but it becomes too difficult for them. And by October of 1943, her parents actually hand themselves in to the Gestapo, and the family are deported to the Theresienstadt camp, where Licht writes letters. People could write letters out of camps, right? Obviously highly censored. And she wrote about how great the food was, how great the potatoes were. So Otto Weidt sends more potatoes. But eventually their number is up and the family are being transported to Auschwitz, which they know at this time will be a death sentence. And it's on the train on the way there where she manages to get a postcard and tell him what's really happening. And she writes this postcard, and on the front she writes, oh, if anybody finds this, could you please post this to Otto Weidt in Berlin? And she throws it out the train window, and, well, it's a copy of it at least is here. Oh, wow. Obviously it works. Now, Otto Weidt at this point, this shows you just how brave he was. A legally blind man in the middle of World War II travels to Auschwitz under the pretense of, well, they might need my brooms, you know? Yeah, and he finds out that her parents are dead. But that Alice herself has been transferred to a different camp, Christianstadt, and so he goes there and he bribes a Polish worker to hide clothes for her and give her a message saying, these are where the clothes are, should you manage to escape. And when the Soviets show up at the beginning of 1945, she's able to find the clothes, travel back to Berlin. Otto Weidt then hides her for the remainder of the war, the next few months, and she survives. She lives until the 1980s.
Wow. That is just, it's a mixture of sort of luck in a way that the letter found her, but also such dedication and hope on Alice's part.
Yeah.
That's such a beautiful story.
Yeah, such bravery as well. You know, to show how selfless Otto Weidt was. You know, even at the worst of it, even during the Battle of Berlin, that he was still hiding people.
And what happened to him after the war?
He sadly died shortly after the war, but he is remembered at Yad Vashem in Israel in a memorial that's called The Righteous Among Nations.
Wow. So many, including Alice, owe that man so much. And what a beautiful way to memorialise him as well.
What a fantastic way to remember him, I completely agree.
By 1943, Allied bombings of Berlin had intensified, causing far greater damage than the raids at the beginning of the war. On the 1st of March, one raid alone killed 500 and injured 2,000 people, whilst rendering almost 100,000 homeless. At the same time, German momentum on the Eastern Front stalled, and within a couple of years, the Red Army would reach the German heartland. By 1945, it became increasingly obvious that Berlin would soon become a battleground.
Jonny, by the year of 1945, the Red Army is swiftly encroaching on Berlin, but the city has been largely destroyed already by Allied bombers. What would I see were I to walk the streets at the start of that year?
Yeah, you would see countless bombed out buildings. The city was very heavily bombed from November 1943 onwards. Imagine how many tens of thousands of people that makes homeless. They're worried where their next meal is coming from, and Nazi propaganda at this point is at an all-time high. According to the Nazis, it is the Asiatic hordes who are coming to destroy this country and destroy your culture and your way of life, let's say.
Auch in diesem Gebiet haben die bolschewistischen Bestien die schlimmsten Verbrechen begangen. Das viehische Treiben dieser Untermenschen jagt jedem anständigen Deutschen das Blut in die Schläfen. Das sind die Untaten der Verbündeten Roosevelts christlicher Soldaten. Mordtaten von einem grauenhaften Sadismus haben auch hier den deutschen Soldaten gezeigt, dass es gegen diesen Gegner kein Wanken und keinen Pardon mehr geben darf.
And how were they preparing the city for the invasion?
Well, there was no preparation they could do to try and win this battle. They were so outnumbered and outgunned. But barricades were being set up, trams were being parked across streets and so. And actually, a couple of months before this, Hitler had given what is now popularly known as the Nero Order for German forces to destroy anything that could be useful to the invading Allied forces. And so bridges, very much like the bridge we're standing on, would have been wired to blow up. In fact, the plan was for the Waffen-SS to destroy every single bridge in Berlin.
And what about the civilians, Johnny? Had they been evacuated out of the city?
People are being evacuated to the city as the Soviets crossed the Oder River during the Battle of Seelow Heights. Berlin is seen as the safe place to come. People are picking up everything they know and they're moving here. And when they arrive, what will they see on the walls? Where will they want to hide? They will see the letters LSR, means Luftschutzraum, air raid shelter. But Berliners with their dark sense of humor would have joked that it meant Lern schnell Russisch, learn Russian quickly.
Oh gosh, well, they thought that it would have been a safe haven, but very quickly this was going to become a hellhole.
Yeah, it was the eye of the storm.
Yeah.
Hier mussten die Bolschewisten unter blutigen Verlusten erfahren, dass die deutsche Faust in ihrer Kraft nichts eingebüßt hat. Hinter dem deutschen Soldaten steht ein einiges Volk, entschlossen für die Freiheit und für das Glück seines Vaterlandes das Letzte herzugeben.
And then, of course, Johnny, the Battle of Berlin begins. And if there was ever a place to see evidence of the bitter fighting that ensued in the spring of 1945, it's right here.
Yes, this is one of the more impressive collections of bullet holes that we still have, but you can find loads of them all throughout town. You have to imagine when you see a building like this is a building that survived. This is one that was okay. People do often want concrete numbers of, was 90% of the city destroyed? And I think that that's not really the right way to go. You cannot really say for sure. Certainly the western part of the city would have been safer from the Soviets fighting because they came from the east, although they did envelop the city. But the western part of the city is where the RAF and US Army Air Force came from. So yeah, every building in this city would have seen some damage. Some of it completely irreparable. Some buildings would have been completely razed, and then some buildings would look more like this.
And you can imagine this building itself, there probably would have been sandbags in the windows. They would have been defending this building to the very last drop of blood.
Yes, absolutely. The battle moves back street by street by street. And you can also imagine that there must have been a machine gun or so inside of here when you see just where the Soviet fire was concentrated. The Soviets were trying to envelop the city and get closer and closer towards the center.
I mean, is it true that the Wehrmacht was mainly full of OAPs and members of the Hitler Youth?
Kind of. So they wouldn't have been official Wehrmacht members, but it's a kind of all hands on deck moment in a way, let's say. So there's a people's militia that's formed right at the end of the war called the Volkssturm. And essentially, any men that are left in the city will go and train on a Sunday and put on a uniform or a badge that says that they're part of this militia. So you have, in some cases, elderly men putting on their World War I uniforms and pulling out old weapons. But yeah, the worst part of that is what you mentioned, is children. The stories of 12-year-olds defending this city with what are called Panzerfausts, basically a kind of one-shot bazooka. And what they would do is quite often blow the tracks off of tanks to leave the kind of T-34s as sitting ducks. And the driving force behind this and any Wehrmacht soldiers that are left is the Waffen-SS, the armed and militarized wing of the SS, who really would be trying to root out any defeatism within the remnants of these German forces. So if anybody looked at how vastly outnumbered, outgunned and outclassed they were and said, I don't want to fight, this is the end, I want to wave the white flag, then they would be executed, quite often in the street.
And it's when you see the damage here and the bullet holes, I mean, it doesn't even bear thinking about children as young as 12 facing millions of Soviet soldiers in perhaps this building right here.
Certainly it could have been some buildings like this. There's more residential buildings around here. Berliners were mostly hiding in the cellars of their buildings during the battle, and they could hear the front coming. Right? It would be a distant rumble, and then it would get closer, closer, closer day by day until, eventually it goes past you. And those cellars would have been raided. Often if men were inside of them, the Red Army would just shoot them. They would say, a USS, bang, dead.
Yeah, and let's speak a bit about the Soviet army, who are... a lot of their soldiers have been through years of bitter fighting. They've seen many of their comrades die in this war. When they come into the city, the final battle, they don't take mercy on anyone.
No, and you say they would have seen their comrades fall, and it's more personal than that. You're talking about entire villages wiped out, destroyed, children, killed across Soviet territory as Germany invaded in 1941. For a lot of people, this is very personal, and they've been told, Soviet propaganda says to, take revenge really on the German people. And even though there are orders not to attack and assault women in particular, it is, in many cases, women who end up the victim of the assault of Soviet soldiers. Incredibly brutal assaults. Women, I say women, in some cases young girls, elderly women, who are attacked sometimes by multiple Soviet soldiers at one time.
Well, Johnny, it's a horrific scene above ground. But at this point, the Germans' depressed and quite frankly psychotic leader, he's not above ground, he's below it.
He is. Adolf Hitler is hiding in his bunker until the very last moment, until the very end of the war. And his bunker wasn't far from here. Let's go and see it.
Yeah, let's go.
Whilst Hitler's capital was being destroyed by the Allied powers, the German leader desperately attempted to devise a plan to save his crumbling empire. He did this underneath what is today an unassuming parking lot.
Well, Johnny, you really do take me to the most beautiful of locations, but this really is one of the most significant sites that tells the story of the fall of the Third Reich.
Yeah, you'd never guess to look at it, but this is one of the most visited places in Berlin. We're standing on top of where Adolf Hitler's bunker used to be. In fact, the oldest buildings that we can see in this area are from the 1980s, and so I think it's really important to get across a sense of just how different this place would be. This wouldn't be a place where, regular people could just waltz in. This was actually gardens behind government ministries. The Foreign Office was over here, and the Reich Chancellery was over here, where Bismarck had his office, in the 1870s. And it's also important to mention just how much the Third Reich would have changed this area as well. Adolf Hitler didn't like the old Reich Chancellery. He said it was a bit too small and poxy, too modest. Modesty wasn't really a key trait of his, and so he had Albert Speer design a great big new Reich Chancellery for him, essentially a big vanity palace.
And this is one of two bunkers that they built around this site.
So there are two bunkers, and they're built in two very separate, distinct phases. The first upper bunker was built in the mid-1930s as part of renovations of the official Chancellor's residence, which Hitler then said was too small and poxy for him. He wanted a much larger one over here. The second lower bunker next door to that was then built in 1943. So the first one is all hubris. We're going to take over all of Europe. We only need this little thing. In 1943, they build much deeper with thicker walls, much thicker walls. Really because they know that they're going to be defending this capital at some point. There's a whole complex of rooms down there that was built essentially as a command center for what would be the final days of the war. And you mentioned that when Hitler came back here, January 45, he moved into the bunker, but that's not how he saw himself. He wanted to live in his great big vanity palace, the new Reich Chancellery, but there's a certain point where that's not possible because it takes a direct hit from a bomb in an American air raid, and it's only then in February where this becomes his, let's say, permanent and final home.
What was the atmosphere like? How many rooms were there? How many people were crammed into this complex?
Inside of the bunker, it would have been damp, dark. It would have been incredibly disorienting when bombs and shells start to explode above them. There were about 30 rooms and lots of people would be coming and going. Hitler's going to direct the final days of the war down there, and he knows this. He's already made the decision in January 45 that he wants to die in his bunker. He's already talked with a couple of his close confidants about it, again, including Albert Speer. And so the bunker is designed to have space for all of those kind of guards and soldiers and generals to come and go, also his personal secretary, but also those closest to him. There's room in there for Joseph Goebbels, his wife Magda, and their 6 children as well. The bunker is also supposed to be totally self-sufficient, so it can generate its own power, it has its own water system, ventilation system, and also communications lines so that he can still contact the remnants of German forces.
I can't even imagine what it must have been like down there, especially considering you would have heard the sound of shelling and the city being battered above you.
Yes, they certainly would have felt it. Of course, with the air raids, the damage is in a sense kind of random, right? They don't know exactly where they're going to fall. So you've got that fear of the unknown. But then as we get into April, it's actually the 20th of April, Adolf Hitler's 56th and final birthday, that the first Soviet shells land on the very edge of East Berlin. Now, whether or not Adolf Hitler knew that those first Soviet shells were landing, whether or not the Soviets even knew that they'd hit the city on such a poignant date, that's rather impossible to say. But it gives us an insight into his mindset at the time. He's surrounded by doctors who are, feeding him lots of drugs to keep him awake and alert. He's also surrounded by people who are not giving him the right kind of information, because if Hitler receives news that he doesn't like, then he shouts and he yells. When he's given intelligence that so many millions of Soviet soldiers are going to enter German territory, he says, well, whoever came up with this intelligence is an absolute idiot. And so he ends up surrounded really by yes men, whilst having his brain addled by drugs. As to what was actually going on in his head, no one can say for sure. His hand was constantly shaking. Perhaps he had Parkinson's. Perhaps it's nerve, stress, drugs, lack of sleep. That's really impossible to say.
And let's talk about the key figures around him at the time. Very close with Goebbels, isn't he? There's stories that Goebbels is almost reading him sort of bedtime stories of famous German comeback victories.
Yes, Goebbels and Hitler were kind of obsessed with this moment. 12th of April 1945, President Roosevelt sadly dies, and Hitler and Goebbels talked about this as their Miracle of Brandenburg moment. Now, the Miracle of Brandenburg took place in 1763 when the Prussian king, Frederick the Great, was able to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat in the midst of a war with Austria, Russia, and France. You can really see that Hitler idolized Frederick the Great and saw himself as this kind of next great German leader. Frederick the Great, I think, would have absolutely hated Hitler, by the way. But to kind of bring this point home, I guess, there was actually a portrait of Frederick the Great on Hitler's bedroom wall in the bunker, the only piece of art to be brought into the bunker. I mean, it's like a teenage boy looking up to that idol somehow. I guess it does show you really how deluded he was.
And the other key leaders, Goering is off playing with his train set in his mansion. Himmler's having a bit of a nervous breakdown as well, but they do at some point convene here.
Yes, Goering did have this big train set in his lavish mansion. He actually blew his mansion up using around about 80 Luftwaffe bombs to make sure that the Soviets wouldn't be able to take it. He does come here on the 20th of April with Himmler to celebrate Adolf Hitler's birthday, to have dinner down there in the bunker, and then Goering and Himmler actually leave. Goering goes down to the south, to Bavaria, sends a message up to Berlin and says, if you don't make it, Adolf Hitler, is it me who's in charge next? And Hitler doesn't like this. He sees this as betrayal. So now Goering's a public enemy. Whereas Heinrich Himmler really does turn traitor. Himmler tries to broker a deal with Western forces where they will stop fighting the West, and the West can just sit and watch as the Nazis turn all of their attention onto defeating Stalin for them as a kind of favor.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? And in terms of the final days for Hitler in late April 1945, what were they like? What was the atmosphere like down in the bunker below us?
You have generals literally running back and forth as Berlin is being blown up to get orders about how to defend this sector of Berlin and that sector of Berlin. Eventually Hitler starts giving orders out on the public radio, so everybody knows what's happening.
So he's still able to do that from his bunker?
He's able to broadcast on the radio, but if your enemy knows exactly what you're doing, it's not going to work.
It's like almost a farce in a way. The final day of Hitler's life, why does he take the decision to commit suicide on the 30th of April?
As we get to the 29th of April, Red Army soldiers start to make their way into the very center of Berlin. Where we're standing is, if you want to drive a tank here, it's basically an island. There's a river to the north, there's a canal to the south, and they do meet. They called it Sector Z when they were defending the city, not because it's the last letter, but for the German word for citadel, Zitadella. They break onto this island, as it were, to the north, east, and south of here. And this is when the people closest to Hitler, his closest advisors, tell him it's a matter of hours until they take the bunker. Adolf Hitler decides that, well, if the Soviets are so near, it is everybody else who has failed, not me. So the German people have failed me. I wanted to restore them to greatness, and they're not good enough. And so he'd always put himself across as a single man, a man who is tirelessly working. This is the kind of myth that's built around the Führer. He doesn't have time for kind of normal delights, let's say. And it's at this point that he marries his long-term girlfriend. It's an open secret that they have a relationship. Eva Braun, who becomes Eva Hitler. And on the next day, on the 30th of April, after having lunch, they decide to take their own lives. And so they go into Hitler's bedroom. She takes cyanide, so does he, but he also famously shoots himself to absolutely make sure that he's dead. What happens is the body is brought outside, or both of the bodies together, Hitler and Eva Braun. They are thrown into a crater, they're covered in several liters of fuel, they're set on fire, and only part of his jaw and his teeth remain.
Clearly, the Germans have subsequently not been afraid to acknowledge the history. There's a signpost right there that says this was the exact place, but at the same time, it's just a park, really. People walk their dogs here.
And you make a very good point. I really very much admire how the Germans are not afraid to deal with the darkest parts of their history. This place is marked. You know, you can find it on Google Maps, but you can also find it by standing here and looking at this sign. They're saying this happened here. There's no hiding that. But at the same time, there's a sign in the dirt. They're not saying, and look at how important this moment was or he was.
Hitler was dead. Germany had lost the war. But it would be on the city's eastern outskirts where the conflict would officially be brought to a close.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the Providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity and into light.
So this is the place where the Third Reich ended.
Yes, we're in a former Wehrmacht officers training school that had actually become Red Army headquarters right at the end of the Second World War. Now, there are a few kind of different surrenders to talk about. The Berlin garrison had surrendered at the end of the Battle of Berlin, May the 2nd. There was then actually a German general, Jodl, who surrenders on behalf of German forces on the 7th of May in Reims in France. But even then they said that this will need final ratification. And so Berlin is chosen for quite a few different reasons. One of the reasons being the Allied powers are keen to make sure that Germans know for sure they have lost the war. And that's not supposed to sound simple or childish. It's because of what happened at the end of the First World War, where you had soldiers returning from France to Germany being told that they'd never lost. It had to be clear to the German people and the German forces that they had been utterly defeated.
And it's interesting you say Berlin, but we are really on the outskirts of East Berlin here. Why was this particular building chosen?
Yeah, there's a few reasons. It's a military building, it's still standing, and honestly, for the Allied powers, security is going to be the main risk at this point. So this is a place that they were sure that they could keep secure while the important figures who are signing the documents were here.
And so that's why they didn't sign it under the Brandenburg Gate, for example, albeit that would have been more symbolic. But
yes, that would have been incredibly symbolic, and it would have had quite a kind of cinematic feel to it, I suppose. But yeah, that place was wide open and strewn with rubble and destroyed vehicles, and it just simply wasn't safe.
And you can see we're in the room where it happened. You have the flags of the representatives. Who, though, was representing each nation at this unconditional surrender?
Yes, so all of the representatives here would have had kind of final authority from their higher-ups, but it wasn't Stalin and Churchill that were here, for example. So from the Soviet Union, we had Marshal Zhukov, who, had won the Battle of Berlin in Stalin's eyes with the assault on the Reichstag. For the Brits, there was Air Marshal Tedder. For the Americans, General Karl Spaatz. And for the French, General de Lattre de Tassigny.
And who represented the broken German army at this point?
You're absolutely right. Germany was completely broken and essentially rudderless at this point. Adolf Hitler, who had amassed all of this power, all of these titles into the role of the Führer, was dead. He'd taken his own life a few days before. This was now the 8th of May, and there was something of a fledgling German government at this time. Essentially, Dönitz had been made president, Admiral Dönitz, and it was under his leadership, let's say, that Field Marshal Keitel was sent to represent the German armed forces.
And give me a sense of what the atmosphere was like in the lead up to this conference and also within the conference itself.
I think for the Allied powers, there was a sense of anticipation, a sense of jubilation. Even there were lots of journalists that were here as well. On the German side, the representatives had been flown into the city. They were driven through their ruined capital. Actually, some of the eyewitnesses here would write about how they were almost shaking and in tears on the way in. But when Keitel enters this room, it's actually both Tedder and Zhukov that say about him that he was very arrogant, that he stood up and that he marched in and he was carrying a baton and he's wearing an eye patch. I mean, if you were to essentially draw a cartoon picture of a Nazi, this is what Keitel looked like at this time.
And Zhukov himself was a pretty intimidating figure, had his notoriously a lot of medals across his uniform.
Yes, certainly even more after this one would expect, yes. Zhukov, I guess, in a way, was holding court here. It's Zhukov that's seen as the man who's taken Berlin. The Red Army have certainly taken Berlin, and they're hosting the other Allied powers as guests, you could say.
And Zhukov actually writes about what happens here as well.
Yes, so the entire ceremony takes about 1 hour, and it starts very late in the night of the 8th of May and continues into the 9th. This is why some countries today celebrate the 8th of May, as we do in the UK and in Germany, for example. That's marked as the end of the war in Europe. In Russia, of course, present-day Russia still, the 9th of May is marked as the end because it takes some time and it goes over midnight. After everything is signed, the Germans are kind of escorted out the room, let's say, and the Allied powers sit down to a great big banquet and a party, and it goes into the early hours of the morning. It's quite funny. Air Marshal Tedder, he writes about how he's very glad to see that even though some people have had a few too many drinks, none of them are British. And Zhukov writes about how these Westerners don't know how to drink.
Yeah, the Brits can't handle their drink.
Exactly.
Yeah, certainly not vodka. And the actual unconditional surrender document, what was written on it?
Yeah, the documents are quite short. Now, they had to be written in multiple languages, and so they are written in English and Russian and German, but they do say that it's only the English and Russian versions that actually count. And essentially it says that all fighting will cease immediately, right? Be it the army, the air force, the navy, everything is done and total power is handed over to the Allied forces, meaning essentially there is no German state anymore. There is no German government, and there won't be until 1949.
And we've talked a lot about the representatives and the politicians, but I'm also interested in how the civilian population felt about this.
I mean, I really think it depends on who you are as a German. There are some people who would have obviously been Nazis. There are those that might have been swept up in the propaganda, or this idea that the final victory is coming, as the propaganda would have said, or that Germany is working on a wonder weapon. Those people might have been crushed and defeated. I think the majority of people would have been very happy to know that fighting had completely ended, and they may well have been scared about what's next. I think people in general are scared about the unknown, and certainly Germany's future on the 8th of May 1945 was definitely uncertain. I think most people might have said perhaps potentially better, but uncertain.
When I look at this footage, and often do. I think it's one of the most remarkable pieces of archive. The thing that strikes me the most is that what you see here is utter devastation, a truly broken city, a broken people with barely any building left undamaged. And yet, life goes on. The work to start rebuilding the city has begun. The politics surrounding the division of the city is underway. And so, almost inconceivably, there's no time for reflection. No time to truly ponder over what has happened over the last decade. No time to contemplate the utter waste of human life. Reminds me of a quote from Churchill. When asked by President Roosevelt what he should call the war in public, Churchill simply responded, "The unnecessary war." Jonny, we're back where we started. Thank you so much for giving me this tour of Berlin. I feel like I've got so much insight that I wouldn't have got if I had come here on my own. Where can people find you?
Thank you so much. You can find me really all over the internet. So you can find me on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. I have a podcast called History Flicks, the Berlin History Podcast, and of course my own homepage with a blog and a place where you can discover my tours as well.
Well, go check them out. All the links will be in the description. And don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want more content on World War II, just check the videos around us now or the History Hit YouTube channel.